Good afternoon everyone, I welcome you all to this another module of Fundamental of Internet of Things. So we are discussing authorizations. So before going to OAuth, we should be familiar with some methods, like brush up some methods like one-way or mutual authentication or two-way authentication. What are these things? So generally, passwords and all other security patterns are commonly used to authenticate the web server or mobile phones, and so are the common method used for basic device security in IoT also. But in general, in context, as IoT has like quite a broader picture, it is consists of application, network, and sensor layer. So IoT secure authentication must be provided to protect the potentially sensitive sensor data being shared over the ecosystem that we call as Internet of Things, or even for that matter fog or cloud also. Now generally the internet websites that are using the passwords or authenticate sites through a secure socket layer, that is SSL protocol, to provide authentication. But in IoT it is difficult to use SSL directly because of the IoT scale and the constraints of the devices. So some of the authentication methods which are generally used are, and I guess you might be familiar with them also. One is one way authentication, where one party is authenticated and another party is not authenticated. So this one way authentication, when we talk of our normal internet networks, so this what happens कि whenever we visit, जब भी हम किसी whenever we visit any website, जब भी हम किसी website पे जाते हैं which has a publicly trusted SSL and TLS certificate, then without us noticing it, that our web browser basically authenticates and checks its authenticity, and we are able to browse the data on that website. But if our browser is not able to entrust the certificates produced by the web server, then browser automatically notifies you the website you are trying to visit is not safe or not secure or something like that, and it asks you whether despite of this security threat you might to proceed. If you want to proceed, you proceed. But if this is known as one way authentication, where web server, without knowing, notifying to you, it checks whether the website you are trying to visit is general or not. In IoT scenario, we can say that if any let's say mobile devices want to access some information or transport, then it requests the servers ask who are you, they share its identity, which is actually every device has its security ID, UID, everything. Like for mobile, your share your IMSI, and this authenticates, and you are allowed to get access to whatever you want. So this is basically one way authentication, where one entity has to be authenticated. So now we have mutual authentication, or it is also known as two-way authentication. Here both server and client, if we talk of in a computer network, so that both the servers and clients in SSL TLS session are authenticated. And it is also possible that this criteria is useful in very like a lot of circumstances. In mutual authentication, important thing is that once the server authenticated during the handshake, it will send a certificate request message to the, it sends a some certificate request message sort of something to the client, and client has to respond by sending a certificate to the client authentication, to the what you call as to the server for the authentication. It is like, let's say that this is a client, and let's say this is the resources network this client want to access. Then he sends a hello message, and server handshakes by responding. Then server asks, kindly provide me your certificates shares its own certificate and asks client to share its certificate, then this is a request for the certificate. Clients responds by providing his certificate. Here it is important to note that before asking client for the certificate, first after a hello message, server sends its certificate to authenticate its identity and then ask for a certificate of the client, and then client responds by providing its what you call as certificate. So this is quite important, but in IoT scenario these what you call as we are aware that these smart IoT devices have actually their roots very deep inside the world. So it quite becomes difficult to follow all these authorization authentication methods. So one of the common standard which is used for authorization and this authentications is widely known as AUTH. Its first 1.0 version was there. Today we have 2.0 authorization system. So we'll be quickly looking up that what you call as OAuth authentication system based system is. So this authentication OAuth based authentication scheme in Internet of Scenario, which is presently being used, is an basically open standard for authorization. This is basically this is quite important to remember that it is basically open standard. This is basically open standard for authorization, and this is most commonly accessed or most commonly used for logging in the third party website without exposing their password. So it provides user secure delegate access to the server on the behalf of resource owner and what do you call it, the owner of the browser. Facebook, LinkedIn, Insta, all these kind of things are using these OAuth certification only. Here if we see this diagram, all these bold lines, all these bold lines, and this we have a dotted line. So all these bold line, they denotes user using the browser or manual entry, and these dash wala lines, they denotes the data flow between the user and the service provider. So this is the communication which is basically showing the web browser or manual entry or trying to access some resources, and this is the what you call as communication which is taking place between the resource owner and the client. So basically whenever you are trying to what you call as gain access, you request a token, then once this token is granted, then the contents are once was obtained, the contents are allowed to be accessed, and once this access is granted, this both way communication is what you call as both way communication is established. Typically these are the exchange of tokens which takes place between the customer and the what do you call as server. This is the basic conversation which takes place between server and the client. So basically if we have to understand, basically OAuth is OAuth is basically open standard, and it is an authorization framework that enables the application to obtain a limited access to user account on an HTTP service. As I told, Facebook, GitHub, all these things are basically working on OAuth authorization. It basically works by relinquishing or delegating user authentication to the server that hosts the user account, so it is something like that. I have a Gmail account, I am accessing something to the Facebook will grant me the access and fall back to Gmail server for checking up my these days lot of websites we try to open, they say, do you have a account? No, then you can log in using Google, or you can log in using Facebook. So this all authentication is done by that server from the server on which you are having account. So this all communication is possible because of OAuth authorization party, as it basically leaves or relinquishes the what you call as the authentication part to the host, which is hosting the user identity, or which is using the ID of the what you call as client, ID of the client. So basically, if we talk in slightly general, user OAuth, 4 crucial roles are defined. One is the resource owner, then obviously you have a client, then you have a server to host the resources, and you have a X authorization server. So when we talk of resource owner, he is the user who authorizes an application to access their account. The application's access to the user account is limited to the scope of authorization granted. Getting my point? So this resource owner is the user who authorizes the application to access their accounts, to access their accounts. Now we have this client. The client basically is an application that wants to access the user's account, Before it may do so, it may be authorized by the user, and the authorization must be validated by the API, that is client. Suppose if I am trying to log in Facebook, then Facebook is a client. If I allow Facebook to check my detail credentials from the Google, then Google is basically a owner, and client on my behalf is Facebook. So this is what the client, what you call as client is. Then we have resource or authorization service. This server hosts the protected user's account, and authorization server verifies whether this is not. So this is your authorization body, which will authenticate, which will confirm Facebook, yes, take the he is allowed to, and this is his authorization level. So then if we generally talk in context of client, and let's say this is your service API, then first authentication request would be sent. Once this authentication authorization is granted, authorization or authentication granted, like client is authenticated and authorization granted, then it request back for the particular authorization grant. It gives it a some sort of token that is generally known as access token. Then access token is produced, then the server release the content, So basically what is happening here is that initially first the application request authorization to access the service resources from the user. Then if the user authorizes the request, the application receives the authorization grant. Then application request this The application requests what do you call as application requests to access token from this authorization server or API by presenting authentication of its own identity and authorization grant, which this client or this Facebook server will have to obtain from the user Now then this application identity is authenticated, and if the authentication grant is valid, the authorization server issues an access token to the application Then the application requests the resources, the particular presents the authentication token, and asks it to verify and let him access the protected resources. Once this is done, then the access token, if this access token produced is valid and user is authenticated, authorized, and he is authorized to review the particular amount of content which is he trying to content, then this relinquishes the content or protected data to the client I hope I am clear on this, and this is quite